All right, we're going to start here on the stage, but we hope that people will continue to trickle in. Thank you so much to CPDP for organizing the conference. We're very honored to be on the main stage. I'm Claire Pershan. I'm EU Advocacy Lead at the Mozilla Foundation. We are here at CPDP, as we can hear. There's lots of CPDP noise, which means that most of you have spent the last day and a half very deep in discussions about data protection, about privacy, also now about omnibus, simplification, and sovereignty. And we're not going to leave those topics entirely during this session, but we are going to take a wider frame and take a step back from some of these particular angles. And I'm really pleased that we're going to be able to do that with these panelists. So Mozilla Foundation has spent over 2 decades now believing something a little bit different about technology, believing that the internet and the technology that's built on top of it should be people-centered, that it should value first communities and it should grow with and for those communities rather than grow at their expense. But this is not the dominant view, and this is not our lived reality of technology for the most part. Today's technology landscape is in many ways more concentrated, more data and also more energy hungry, and more separated from the communities and humans it should serve than ever before. It also feels, especially here in Europe, that we are at a tipping point. We are fundamentally questioning what technology is around us, and is that the technology that we actually want and that is actually good for us? And so with that, I'm delighted to have these 3 panelists who are going to be able to talk to us about what is more human-centered technology in practice and how can European policy continue and further that. So working from left to right, we have Benoît Corti, who is a data scientist working for the French National Assembly and also a member of Data for Good France. But he's here in his capacity as president of Code Carbon, a nonprofit that helps to measure the carbon cost of AI and is backed by the Mozilla Foundation Incubator. We also have Nadia Nadasan, who's a researcher and design facilitator based in Madrid. And among other projects, she's the lead for a project called Small AI, which is looking at context-aware, community-rooted alternatives to large-scale AI. And she's also working on one of the data spaces related to cultural heritage, which she can perhaps talk to us about. And last, we have here Agnes Crepé, who's head of software engineering at Fairphone, which, for those who don't know it, is a modular smartphone and a social enterprise. She's also deeply involved in initiatives related to open source, diversity and inclusion in tech. And she's a board member of Jumanji, which is a B Corp, a group of B Corp startups working within planetary boundaries. So with that, I want to open to a first set of questions for the panelists, which is really interrogating also what we've titled this session, which is right-sized technology. But what is that to each of you? I want to ask, is that kind of technology what we're currently seeing most encouraged by the policy landscapes as they are today? So first, turning to you, Agne. Tell us about the Fairphone. Introduce us to the Fairphone, which I believe is 13 years old, and how it's been affected by some recent legislative initiatives like the eco-design and also maybe the DMA.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So yeah, Fairphone, so as you explained, is a smartphone company. We did start 13 years ago. And when we started, of course, right, phones were not super sustainable, non-lasting. Who knows Fairphone in the room? Okay, not that bad. And yeah, we did fight. We did some lobbying to have something in the law. So you spoke about the DMA, but also the eco-design directive is quite a thing for us, because we have been demonstrating for the decades that it's possible to be long-lasting products and being a business company, not a non-profit, but even if you are a social company. The goal is to be a company, a profitable company, to show to the industry that it is possible to combine this goal of building ethical products and being profitable. Yeah, we have been lobbying about spare parts availability, about long-term support, software support for smartphones, for example. And then, finally, after years of lobbying, it did work, not only because of us, but also because of all the partners. And then the Eco-Design Directive came into force last year. And I had this question recently, like from a journalist who asked me, okay, but now, what is the difference between Fairphone and Samsung or Google? Because they need to comply with those regulations. And for sure, right, there is still some stuff to do. We can still improve the way that we define a fair product, for sure, right? When it comes to avoid some practices like pairing. Pairing means that sometimes the camera, the spare part of the camera, could be linked to the motherboard, and you cannot change it easily, even if you have the component in your hands. So we are against those kind of practices, and this is quite common in the industry still. We are also fighting against the fact that some batteries are still glued in the smartphone, so we still have some battles to win. But it's still good to see that as a small company, we are only 150, 60 people. It's good to see how it is possible, even if you are small, to change those kind of regulations. The expression that I did use with Claire during the preparation of the panel was this image, this metaphor of being the mosquito in the room, right? We are small, but we can be annoying. So that's a bit what we try to do. And about the DMA, because perhaps most people in the room have heard about the DMA. About the DMA, it was anyhow a good thing. So for example, probably you remember the first time that you had to install your smartphone, you had to choose in between several browsers and several search engines, right? This is an immediate consequence of the DMA. You don't have to choose one browser or one search engine, right? And this freedom is actually something that we wanted to have in our device, right? And now this is within the law. We don't have to find some workarounds to implement that. This is really, really thanks to all those EU regulations that we were able to implement that. Because Fairphone, and I will speak about that later, we are really, really into the open source activities, into promoting the fairness when it comes to the software within our device.
Thank you. If I could ask just one follow-up, actually, too, because
Sure.
I think a lot of the audience knows about the DMA, but less about the eco-design. If there's one thing that you would convey to us about eco-design regulation, what is it that we should know about it?
Yeah, so as I said, right, more or less, this is a combination of a lot of criteria that can help you to have a long-lasting fund. So spare parts availability is for 7 years after the end of sales. So generally speaking, it means 9 years. And long-term support, 5 years after the end of sales. That's more or less the main examples.
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, next turning to you, Benoit. Tell us about Code Carbon. What inspired Code Carbon, and why would a project turn to it now?
Yeah, thanks, Leah, and thanks for me, and thanks for Mozilla to supporting Code Carbon. And Code Carbon is an old project launched in 2020 by Yoshua Bengio, which was been called Godfather of AI. And at this time, it was made to measure the impact of training of AI, which we call deep learning at this time. And everything has skyrocketed since then, as you may know. For example, in 2022, Sasha Lucioni, board member of Code Carbon, estimate that for the training of the open source model called Bloom, they spend 400 GPUs to train this model, and the estimate of impact in terms of CO2 is 25 tons of CO2. And last year, for people who may not know to count in tons of CO2, it means like 10 round trip from Brussels to New York by plane. And last year, Meta disclosed the impact of the last version of their model called Llama, and they estimate the impact to be 2,000 tons of CO2. So you see the number quite increase. And this year we don't have the spending, the emission of the big models that everybody use. And moreover, we have switched from a world where the training was a problem to a world where even the usage of AI models is a problem, because everybody is now using AI, and also we are using more and more AIs. For example, we are targeting to use AI in an agentic way. And what is an agentic AI? It's shifting from the human-driven chatbot that we all use to something that you just ask, you delegate a task to an AI, and the AI will do multi-turn task talk to itself and using tools to achieve a task completely using tools. For example, as a developer, I don't write code anymore. It's the AI coding agent that write code, test the code, fix the bug, and only when the AI doesn't know what to do next, that it's come back to me. So it's really changed the usage. We are from just that you chat a few times per day to using AI each day. And even Google this morning was talking about having agents talk to other agents. So we are going to an era where the AI will work all the day and maybe all the night also for us. And that's why also in the Cold Carbon nonprofits, we have a project called Ecologist that try to estimate the impact of these AI calls to data centers. And what we compute is that one developer using AI could emit 2 tons of CO2 just for his work. And so, like I said, 2 tons of CO2 is one trip to New York. And so it's really a big impact. And we are 30 million of developers, and these agentic framework are coming for everybody and every work. And also the investment in data centers is expecting to be $1 trillion for next year. So it's really huge investment. And to power them, we will need 30 nuclear reactors that obviously we can't build in 1 year. So it will be fossil fuel that will be used to power them. And I'm not speaking about child abuse in mining and the water usage and electric waste. Maybe we'll talk about it later. And so, 3 years ago, this topic of impact of AI was quite negligible, and now it's really not the case, as we are targeting the airplane industry, for example. And so that's why, for example, Code Carbon is used to build energy score, which is something like the stickers you have on the fridge, for example, when you purchase appliance. It's to estimate for each AI which is the impact, and so the end user could choose the AI based on this impact. Because not all AI are equal. There is some frugal AI that could run on your phone. So it's something that we need to know, because we could use AI wisely. And maybe I will stop there for now. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. And also thank you to the organizers for trying to make it a bit quieter outside. We appreciate it. It is a bit, yeah. Nadia, turning to you. When I first asked you to be part of this panel, I was thinking very much of your work on small AI, which I would love to ask you about. But also, can you just set the stage for us of the things that you're thinking about and working on? I know you're also doing work in Spain and Aragon related to data centers, and a bit what Benoit was speaking about. But what is good technology, and what are you working on now?
So to start with Small AI was an initiative by AIX Design, and it was a research stream thinking about slow AI. And it was an incredible opportunity to ask the question of if we subvert corporate thinking by exploring new perspectives And we asked the question of what if the objective wasn't to scale? How might we find joy? How might we find life-affirming technology? How might we respect the environment? How could we rethink what it means to be sustainable? And there were a few guideposts that were developed as a result of this research, that intelligence isn't universal or placeless. It yields sensitivity and responsibility to the histories of a place, what happened there, and who and what lives there. And then also, how do we think about technologies in terms of community well-being? When we think about data, it's also knowledge. And it's very interesting because through the project, I was very inspired by small technologies, especially indigenous communities like Tehiku Media and even the Project Lisan or Masakane, which are leaders in terms of thinking about linguistic sovereignty and creatively thinking about licensing and what does that mean. So, but it also connects to the work that I'm doing right now. I'm a participant in the AI Assembly, which is with the European Data Space for Culture, and it connects the work, and this work I do believe connects because we are asking cultural institutions to shape how smaller domain-relevant AI systems are developed and used, systems that are transparent, contestable, and aligned with democratic values rather than extractive business models.
Good, thank you. And I really like your reframing of data as knowledge. That seems so obvious, but often when we talk about it in a privacy context, we just think of it as data. So that's really helpful. Next, I want to think about a little bit of what I call ecosystem level change. So some of the recent tech regulation that we've had here has been incredibly impactful. The DSA and the DMA are just beginning to show all the changes that they're going to actually provide. But a lot of these changes are either conduct obligations or are maybe service by service improvements. And we know that what we also need is much more sweeping ecosystem level change. So Benoit, turning back to you, a detail about Code Carbon, which is not a detail at all actually, is that it's open source. So what is it that open source enables at an ecosystem level that proprietary solutions may not?
Yeah, open source allow people to look how the software is made, and it's empower quite the civil society to look inside, to also participate to the project, to contribute it. But it's not magic. It needs maintainers, that we call it. It's people that own the project and fix bugs, and also like me being talk about the project to it being known. And it's also pose a question of fundings because Code Carbon have no company behind it, so like many open source projects. And yeah, it's pose also the question of the mission to ensure transparency. And talking about AI, it's quite different than software because we have sometimes model like Mistral or DeepSeek. We tell them it's open model, but it's the weight of the model. You could download the file, but we lack some licensing to explain, do you have access to the model, but what could you do with the model? Or are you allowed to retrain it? Are you allowed to use it commercially? Does they give you the source code to use to build the model? And they don't do it. And also the data, because there is many bias in AI, and the bias often comes from the data, and if you don't know the data, you can't talk about bias. And so, yeah, we think there is some new licensing like Mulan in China or Open Rails that try to address this topic of what you could do with model, and it's to be more transparent about what we call open.
Yeah, thank you for also connecting it to the licensing discussion. I think these are, really important components of openness. Agnes, actually, turning to you next to continue thinking about open source. So Fairphone, of course, is built on open source software, also open source principles, circularity, interoperability. What legislation or enforcement of legislation is valuable to this sort of product and this sort of modality?
So as I said, DMA did help us, but if I think about how those legislation could be stronger, I will take some example. What we try to to push towards this those legislation and where we failed. So in France, you have what we call the index of reparability, and in Europe now it exists also, right? And the big difference between the French one and the European one, now the French one doesn't exist really anymore, is the price of the spare parts. So imagine that this index of reparability indicates the way that your device is reparable, so long-lasting, right? And in the European legislation, you have no way to take into consideration the price of the spare parts. So your device can be reparable, but if the screen, for example, costs 400 euros, the device can still have a high rate. So we have been fighting for that since years. We did fail on that, but we hope that at one point the regulation will change. About the DMA, we also try to push for the unlockability of the bootloader. So this is a word term, but to put it in a simple word, this is a way to install an open source OS on a smartphone whenever you want, but especially at the end of life of the device, once the manufacturer stops support the device, and of software support, for example. And yeah, for us, this is quite important, not only for privacy reasons, because it's always good to have the possibility to install an open source OS, operating system on your device, but also at the end of life of the device, you can install those operating system, and it can help you to extend the lifespan of the phone. The Fairphone 3 was launched in 2019. We stopped the support this summer. And thanks to the open source aspect and to the unlockable bootloader that we promote within our phones, it's possible for the users to extend by 2 years the lifespan of the phone, so to reach 9 years. And we had loved to have that in the DMA, right? So that's a continuous effort to push those kind of legislation to make sure that it can be fairer.
Thank you. Yeah, I think at CPDP, we don't always talk about hardware and things like longevity, also of software support. And I think this is an important element to bring in. It does have connections with privacy and with other fundamental rights. So thank you for that. And last, Nadia, maybe at even a more philosophical level, what is it about open source or community governance or other principles that you think should be embedded more deeply into tech policy to bring some kind of more sweeping ecosystem level changes?
So I participate in the Decidim open source community. It is a participatory platform developed by the city of Barcelona, and it was created to support democratic participation through an e-governance platform. So the thing about the Decidim community is that open source, yes, is open code, but open source has communities. It's relational. And it's connected to people, networks, and communities that give it meaning and durability. So a strong example in this is Decidim's social contract. When you join the Decidim open source community, you have to sign the social contract. And it's not just a license, it's a political commitment. Organizations that adopt Decidim commit to free software, transparency, privacy, collaboration, and democratic governance. And the social contract creates a network of invested actors, municipalities, civic organizations, researchers like myself, who are not just users, but co-stewards who can join assemblies and direct the development of this technology. This is collective intelligence in practice. And just like frameworks or policies like public AI, it's about creating a foundation for ecosystems around institutions that share commitment to openness and public access, and allowing reliable stewards and intermediaries to shape policies.
If I can ask just you to tell a little bit more about that. Is it working? Like how is the community behind it, and what challenges are you facing?
I think the community is actually incredibly dedicated. There's a yearly conference in Barcelona. It's thriving, I think, actually. It's thriving in the sense that people are incredibly committed. I don't think that you can measure its success by numbers alone, but the level of interest in the interaction with other coders, governments, cities. Cities are cooperating across, cities are creating networks amongst themselves to understand how to better code or implement this theme. And that I think is really interesting. So in that way, I do think it's like very successful. But I do think that, of course, like other open source communities, there are issues like, okay, like maintenance is a very boring thing to fund, but it's important.
Yeah, that's perfect actually, because I want to double down on this notion of commitment from different stakeholder perspectives actually. This kind of ecosystem change takes time and investment, both if we're thinking about EU legislation on the time of the regulator implementing and enforcing new rules, and also in the companies that are adapting to them. So actually, Agnes, turning to you again, what is it that policymakers, well, I'll ask this question to all of you, should be thinking differently about the commitment that it takes to build differently, to prepare for and then adapt to interoperability requirements, for instance, or to kind of prepare for and accept these changes that will take, in some cases, many, many years, actually, to see. So thinking about the perspective of the Fairphone, what has been your journey implementing some of the changes, whether from the Eco-Design Directive, the DMA, or elsewhere?
Yeah, we are quite decorrelated from the legislation because in the end, as I mentioned, we try to do the lobbying before the regulation. We started as an awareness campaign against conflict minerals. We were not a company 13 years ago, so I would say the activist side of the story of Fairphone is not exactly the same as now. But for sure, to build a fund, it takes time. So we need 2 or 3 years to build a new product. And when we think about the feature, the modularity that we want to put in, we iterate a lot. And we work with regulators, but also associations. We are part of the Right to Repair. In Europe, this is a big movement. So we do some R&D together. We take inspiration from them. We work also with some labels. So for example, the TCO, long-lasting label, etc. So it helps us also to shape a bit how we can find what is a fair fund. But this is a long process. And, this is also a continuous improvement. So it happens that sometimes we say, okay, it will not be for this product because we don't have the time to implement this change, but we hope that it will be in the next one. So we try also to decorrelate the sustainability, so the sustainable roadmap to the product itself. What is quite challenging is for us to dedicate time for the lobbying aspect, to make sure that we can also loop in the regulators, the policymakers, to take time with them, and to make sure that the regulation could follow what we think that in practice works or not. What I like is when we are part of those work groups, most of the time it's closed. If I think about the Eco-Design Directive, sometimes we were invited around the table with the big tech and all the manufacturers and the person from the EU, and that's it. And we had one seat as another big tech, so we can have some influence, I would say. But what is difficult is the time that we can dedicate it into that. So sometimes we would love to have 20 people working on reports, demonstrations, etc. So that's a bit the limit of being a small, medium company. But we try to do that. But this is completely decorrelated to the roadmap of our product, which takes 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, thank you for that experience. Benoit, turning to you in your capacity as Code Carbon, which is an open source project in the truest sense that you have no full-time staff. This is a project that is all contributors. What is it that policymakers should understand about support for open source projects like this? I mean, I think there's an incredibly good connotation of open source that, of course, we all agree on, but how do we actually also commit to that belief in open source? What is it that policymakers should understand?
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting that we need to be understood by policymaker because it's not because it's open source, it's often seen as free, and it's true that you could software for free, but you need people to maintain it behind. So there is maybe some incentive to think about. And talking about AI, when we talk about open model, for example, if you use an open model, for example, DeepSeek, if you use it and you think that it's transparent and it's nice because it's open, but you are using it by the interface that is in China and you send all your private data to China, it's a problem. And as open source, you could host yourself the DeepSeek model, for example, the Mistral model, but maybe something you are not aware of, this model is so big that you need €500,000 of hardware just to run it, one instance of them. So, for example, the French government is deploying a medium-sized model to the public servants because they just can't afford to deploy the bigger model. So yeah, we think that even a government is not able to do the deployments of open weights model. It's quite questioning. And yeah, and so if you can't deploy the big model, you could deploy a small model. And the fact that model could be open source is that you could retrain it and fine tune it, as we say. You could take a small open model and train it for your use case, and so it could be as accurate as a big model, but cost you a few parts of it. But you need to take time to do this. And also, because if you think about it, we are using just one model for everything right now. I mean, if you ask question about cooking to ChatGPT. ChatGPT also know about brain surgery and everything, and so we are using very big things that know everything about everything, and we just ask him just one specific task. So yeah, it's really reshape the way we see open source and this field. Yeah.
Yeah, this might also be another tipping point that we're at as well, right? Instead of using the same handful of models for every purpose, we could think of actually thinking about what is it that we need and want and having a right-sized model for that or technology for that. Nadia, turning to you again, thinking about this, well, I'd like to ask you to help us think about this idea of timescales, right? Policymakers think about mandates, largely think about election cycles, technology adoption, commitments to these sorts of projects are on much, much longer timescales. So how should we be explaining the importance of this kind of longer arc? And have you seen any examples that you think are important to bring when we think about this kind of commitment?
So policymakers make policies, but it's often our national and local institutions that have to uphold those policies and are the physical and also metaphysical infrastructure for like what policymaking means. And I think, for example, when working with schools, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, when we think about cultural heritage or cultural heritage data, what I'm inspired by is that the push from these institutions to incentivize different forms, to be enablers, where policymakers take public interest very seriously. And for example, I think there's a huge gap when it comes to, so how do we incentivize policymakers? Well, we need increased literacy about AI. It's not just about being competent enough to use it or capable enough to like create systems, but a literacy around the legal, social, environmental, and like societal impact of this technology, right? So from the Europeana Cultural Heritage Data Space Initiative, what we're seeing is a push for upfront investment in public or shared infrastructure, long-term maintenance, not just development, and capacity building at a local level. How do we build the confidence of the people who are working in these institutions to push back, make different asks, and be part of this policymaking process? And I think that this short-term optimization we need to reorient, and there's also an initiative from civil society and also institutions to reorient from short-term optimization to long-term resilience and recognize that public control means democratic accountability and international cooperation. It's about sovereignty, but also international cooperation so that we work together across scales and networks to be able to think about well-being, public interest, and the environment.
Great. Thank you for that. We've talked a lot now about what policy should do, but as we know, policy doesn't exist in a vortex, it exists in a context. And that context right now is of changing climate, it's of the more and more agentic AI systems and use of industrial pressures coming from outside of Europe as well, changing consumer behaviors. What are the contexts that each of you are most attuned to now? And how should we be building frameworks that are resilient and prepared for those contexts and those future challenges? I think I can just go in order, Benoit, if you want to start.
Yeah, it's as you may have heard, I'm worried about climate change, but what begins to worry me right now is also the social impacts that are coming if agentic AI goes the way the big tech thinks it will go. We will have social impact, and it's mean job loss, and we have to think about, there is a Schumpeter creative destruction, but it took times, and there is also robotic AI that is coming. It's just this year, it's the beginning of mass production of humanoids. So, as policymaker, I think it's time to ask ourselves, do we have to tax these robots? Do we have to tax AI, and how we could do it? And do we need universal income, for example? And all these things is really a huge legal shift. And so it's time to think about it, and it will be difficult. So I don't have the answer.
The context through which I'm thinking about it often, so I work a lot on the topic of intersectionality, and the more I work on it, the more I feel like technology companies are constantly manipulating identity politics, like leveraging people's different identities against the value of their labor or wages or contributions. For example, I made a joke before this panel that if I were standing next to a guy who's 6'2", has a full head of hair, and is particularly handsome, you know who's getting better paid. And you don't even have to second guess why you think that. And to expand on what it means to think about intersectionality in the context of AI, so often identities are leveraged against people's, for example, people's legal status, their race, their gender, their class. And it often, so Mary Gray coined this term ghost labor. So who are ghost workers? These are often people who are hidden or invisible. And why are they invisible? Because they have a different passport privilege. And I recently did a talk on this film called The Belly of AI. When we think about who are the invisible data workers in Europe, these are Ukrainian refugees. These are women working in prisons. These are immigrants. These are people whose labor exists in a gray and black area, but who tech companies are really good at leveraging their precarity to increase their profits. So in terms of how I'm thinking about technology, it is trying to think about what are the positive frictions. So how do culture, place, people, how do we affirm those things to create a positive friction to ensure more life-affirming technologies and systems?
Yeah, I fully agree with what you were saying, Nadia. And if we take a broader scope, we can also think about the decolonial approach of how we can make technology today. So to think about those workers that you were mentioning just before, but also to the people in the mines in DRC, about the people, the data workers in Kenya, etc. So this is what we have been trying to do at Fairphone, and make the workers visible. To make it fair, to make the working condition fairer for them. And this is really, really a big angle for the future of our technologies. Because if we are just focused on the environmental issues, it won't solve the problem. it won't solve the source cause of everything. So, and within the tech, the big techs, I would say, there is not a strong willingness to take into consideration those angles. And it's even worse since, I would say, a few months or years. So that's a big concern. We do see some progress, because at Fairphone we work a lot with people in DRC, China, etc. So we do see some progress in the way that people in the global south are organized and are working with Western countries. Not only people like Fairphone, but NGO, etc. But this is, for policymakers, this is a big call towards them, right? To take into consideration those people. I really like to speak about privacy today in those kind of conference, but we can also think about a broader scope and think about those people, the ones who are living far away from us today.
Yeah, thank you. We didn't talk about the due diligence directive, but of course there are other efforts and also other simplification efforts. So yeah, thank you for that. I think it's clear how some of these challenges are connected, right? Something that is more data extractive, is more energy extractive, is more actually extractive of humans building it as well. As a kind of closing question to each of you, and then I want to open the floor to audience questions as well. What is the single ask you would make of whether it's policymakers, company tech providers, or consumers to think about in terms of what is the right size technology?
Yeah, I think from my side, I think it's time for policymakers to ask for transparency around data centers and the impact of AI, because right now the consumer don't know the impact of what they are doing. So we need to empower customer by telling them each time they use an AI what is the impact, and know that the AI industry is on par with the airplane industry. I think it's time to enforce this by law, and to consumers and companies, and I will tell them to ask themselves, do they really need AI, and if they need this, if they needs AI, to use it wisely and try to look at frugal AI that also have some guides and exist in the shadow of big techs.
So I think I would think about how do we scale AI, and do we actually really need this AI, and under what conditions? I think it's about, I would ask to prioritize public interest, and that means supporting smaller domain relevant AI systems that are transparent, contestable, aligned with democratic values, and ensuring that communities have pathways to remedies and recourse when harms inevitably happen with AI. They are going to happen, and I think one of the biggest issues is that if we look at the scandal that happened in the Netherlands when it came to receiving benefits, or the Austrian employment scandal, in a lot of the implementations of AI, there is a very real impact on people, but often the recourse or the remedy is unaffordable to them. So how do we create pathways to make reparation and repair possible for people? And then the last thing would be to recognize how multiple forms of marginalization or discrimination compound and in these AI systems and disproportionately affect different people.
Thank you. Yeah, on my side, for the policymakers, I would say that perhaps the policymakers can mandate all the public administration to buy some products that are more sustainable. They exist. It's not only Fairphone. I can mention also Framework. This is a brand who are making long-lasting laptops. So you have solutions, right? And it could be super helpful to have governments, schools, whatever, buying those kind of solutions. This is, by the way, the Chinese model. I'm spending a lot of time in China because of the work, and yeah, in China it works like that, right? Huawei, etc. They had at the beginning a lot of command and purchase orders for the administration. So that's a general call, because every time that at Fairphone we have a B2B channel, but we are facing exactly the same criteria as 10 years ago. So I think we need to make sure that those purchase criteria will evolve, especially in the public administrations. And for the end users, super general thoughts, but be curious. Don't accept the opacity of the technology. Try to open. You think it's not that difficult, and even if you struggle, open the door of a repair cafe or try to ask your neighbor. I don't know, but be curious and don't accept the simplicity, because it's, even if it seems to be simple, it is not simple. Thank you.
Great. So more transparency related to energy use, community redress and pathways, and and also consumers going to repair cafes. I love that. And public procurement, excuse me. I think that's very actionable items for our policymakers. So thank you actually for those. And now for your questions, please raise your hand. There's a microphone that we can pass around as well. And if you would, we'd love to know who you are as well before you ask the question, and if you have someone specific that you direct the question to. Yeah, it's true. Thank you for being brave. We have a first question.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Magda Piech. I'm with the Panoptykon Foundation, a Polish pro-privacy and users' rights organization. It's been a really interesting panel, like very many domains put together, very like inspiring. And I'm trying to put my head around the omnibus changes, and especially those changes around browsers and consent for cookies. And there are these alternatives on how to express consent, how to empower users that are being discussed under this proposal now. And I've been really thinking on to what extent this solution that are coming from companies like Code Carbon, so a bit bottom up, so to say, to what extent they can change the reality that we are in, right? What's your experience? And then I'm very interested in Fairphone, like you've been so consistent in introducing the change, so it made me optimistic. But my question is like, after years of being engaged, how much you believe that the change is happening, that this change is possible, and what can we all do to support it as society?
Yeah, to speak about the transparency we advocate for, it's really rely on policymakers, because we don't see big tech going in the right direction. There is some small step made, for example, Mistral in France. They try to do a life impact assessment of the training of the AI, but for example, they refuse to disclose the energy usage. They just disclose the CO2 emissions because they think the energy usage will let them opponents know the size of their model, and so there is some IP in questions. So yeah, it's quite difficult, but I think if the numbers we expect is true, I think we have to enforce it. And when you buy a car in Europe, you already know how many CO2 they will emit, and I think we need the same thing for AI. Maybe just don't go even like what we want, but do some path in the right way. And Claire was telling me yesterday that Microsoft, for example, is trying to prevent Europe to ask them to disclose the impact of data centers. And what they want is just publish a mean of all data centers in Europe, but not by data center. So yeah, I advocate for being having the impact of each query, and they don't want to disclose even the impact of world data center. So yeah, there is some work to do.
And about Fairphone, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of hope, right? because we have been building fund for almost 13 years now, and we are still here and we are growing, which is good. We had some wins also regarding the regulation, the 7 years of spare parts availability, the long-term support. Now this is forbidden to have a fund with 2 years of software support in the market. So for us, this is something huge, right? And the fact that, we are growing in terms of sales shows that it's possible to attract users, consumers, willing to pay a bit more for those kind of funds, right? So that's quite good. We are the optimists, like the thing. And also the fact that we are a social company. So, you know, in France, you have also the scope, other kind of models. So I do have a lot of hopes on those kind of structures, right? In between NGO and formal companies. And I do think that those kind of models are growing a lot within Europe, right? So that's something that when I teach, when I do some lectures in some engineering school, I'm always explaining to the students that you have alternative models when it comes to the model of enterprise, right? So those kind of enterprise can have a mission, right? As we have at Terthon. So I think it's quite, we are quite optimistic.
And I guess I would say, for example, thinking about data centers, who are your unlikely allies? Because, for example, the construction of data centers, at least in Aragon in Spain, one way to create more friction around data centers being built is to support farming subsidies, is to support land management rights, to protect green areas. And this is not an immediate thing that you may think about, but then now you have to get in touch with different cooperatives and different actors, and because these all are connected. Technology is becoming increasingly attached to land, environment, and climate. And then so who are the other stakeholders that you haven't thought about that have a same positive interest?
In Marseille, for example, a lot of people, citizens, did build a big movement against the construction of data centers, right? And they are questioning the common interest, the public interest, etc. So I do think that this is also a good path, right, to question the need of those kind of technologies.
Great, thank you. We have another question that we can take over here.
Hello, I'm Flavio Piemontese, student from the University of Glasgow. I have two questions, actually. One for Mr. Courty. So besides the monitoring of the impact of data centers, do you also explore alternative solutions? Like, for example, I'm thinking last year in this very room, there was a speaker that was suggesting to reuse the heat emissions from the data centers for city heating or anything in that regards. And for Ms. Crepet, I was wondering if besides repairability, you also investigate the origins of the spare parts besides the cost, let's say, so the environmental cost or the fairness of the labor that's been employed to extract materials, I guess, in that regard. Thank you.
Good questions. We have the discussion, for example, with LeafCloud. It's a Netherlands provider that builds small data centers. I don't know if we call it this, but it puts servers inside existing buildings, and the heat of the server is used to heat the water for the shower, for example. So it's really a nice usage. But it's small industry, and it costs more because you don't have the cost effect of building big data centers. But I think, we have to look more in this type of solution. And there is also in Paris a swimming pool that is heated by some data centers. So it's part of the solution to have a smaller data center and near the where you need it and where you could reuse their heatings. And so, yeah, it's really a nice question, and we could have hoped to have a smaller model in smaller data centers, and it could also be a more sustainable future.
Yeah, so about the question about the spare parts, right? You asked about the spare parts. So 10 years ago, we didn't have a department called circular operations, so we built the spare parts from scratch, right? And since I would say 6 or 7 years, we have been working on making sure that the spare parts can be built from the refurbished materials. So, and also for the fun, since 3-4 years now, we are taking back some funds and we sell them via our web shop. And when it's not possible, then we sell the spare parts. We include also recycled materials within the spare parts. At the beginning, Fairfund was really on the virgin mining, right, in improving the conditions of the people in DRC. We founded the Fair Cobalt Alliance. That's more or less working with the family in DRC to improve their condition for the people in the mines. And step by step we moved, but we are still on the virgin mining, but we moved towards the urban mining. How we can make sure that we can recycle some materials. But the issue is we lack some R&D on that at the industry level, because it's really difficult, for example, to take back the neodymium. One example of the metal, right? It's like, think about when you do a cake at home, you mix a lot of elements, sugar, blah, 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 butter, and then you put the cake in the oven, and then it's really difficult to take back the eggs or the sugar. That's more or less the same with the alliage of the metals, like for the neodymium, for example, or the gold. So I'm not saying that it's not possible, I'm just saying that it's really much more difficult. So at least taking back some components and then trying to refurbish them, it's easier than trying to collect the metal, right, itself, and then go back to the production cycle. But we have been trying to do that since 6 to 7 years now, indeed, yeah.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? Okay, great. Right over here, please, thank you. Yeah, and to reflect on that, Agnes, there is obviously some advantages that come with some degree of scale, right? Getting these things to happen on a more industry-wide changes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had also this question from a journalist, okay, what kind of tech innovation are you doing? It's a bit weird what I will say, but nothing. I mean, we are not launching a new display technology, a new battery technology. What is innovative in the way that we do things is the fact that we want to make fun fairer. So to think about the workers in the supply chain and to think about the environment, to make them long-lasting. I'm the head of software engineering, so my focus is really on fighting software obsolescence. And I can tell you that this is super innovative. But of course, right, it's not focused on launching a new technology, a new display battery technology.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the discussion. Just have a question, because now in Europe, especially within the Commission, there is a lot of discussion regarding tech sovereignty. And I was wondering how you can make the policymaker understand or take in account everything what you discuss, like the criteria of ethic, I would say, in account of how we define, how we can have a definition of what is tech sovereignty. It's for everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, difficult question. Because right now, it doesn't exist, right? A technology fully done in Europe or fully done in a country like France or Belgium, especially if you think about the hardware, right? Coming back always on the hardware. On the software, okay, something is doable, but the software is always running on something. And this thing, I mean, you have high chance to, the current market is really worldwide, right? And I do think, and that's the same for Fairfund, we do think that we should zoom out and take into consideration how we can improve the technology sector to make it fairer at the world level. Why? Because this is connected to the decolonial turn that I was speaking about just before. So we are not against, I don't know, a company who can be willing to assemble funds in Europe, or I don't know, making processors in Europe. Of course, it is also a path, an interesting path to explore, but this is really, really long term. And right now, 97% of the funds are assembled in China, and 75% of the cobalt comes from the DRC. And those people there are struggling. So this is why we are really focused on that. But I do think that it can be, we can think about several paths, right? There is a path to do more stuff in Europe, but it's not at this level yet in the market.
Yeah, and sovereignty, yeah, it's difficult. There is many definition of it, and so it's hard to know. From my side, I think it's mean not relying on US technology, for example. But we use it inevitably. It's difficult to have no US technology and to have only Europe technology, but we have to go step by step in the process to reappropriate ourselves, maybe the hosting, maybe the software stack and things like that. And I think really the public spending could be targets and oriented, and there is also tax exemption that we could look at. For example, if we give tax exemption to US data center in Europe, maybe we're quite questioning this. But yeah, it's really a tough problem.
I think in terms of the data space, something that we are thinking about is what does it mean to define sovereignty around cultural heritage data? Because often these systems rely on information that has been made public through cultural and arts institutions, galleries, museums, libraries, archives. And part of that is defining the terms of reuse of this data so that the relationship is reciprocal and not depleting the resources of these cultural heritage institutions and organizations. But I think part of that is like either creating a bridge or increasing the capacity or the knowledge of policymakers, because there is like a certain level of understanding about what data is, how does it work, and what reuse entails, and creating either the confidence within the cultural heritage community to clearly communicate that, or demanding like greater literacy from policymakers themselves.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions, if there are any more in the audience. But okay, perfect. We can probably get those too. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the really great panel. I'm enjoying it very much. My name is Rania Wazir. I'm with a small startup in Austria, and I'm really interested in the concept of small AI and thinking innovation differently. So I've heard actually all of you mention innovation in different ways. So I'm interested in your views on how we can redefine innovation so that what you guys are actually doing is considered innovative and can be pushed also on a policy level.
Great.
So I mean, when I small AI was thinking about, okay, if I think about innovation outside of scale or power, what are the, like, often right now our moral compass leans towards big ideas from small places and small corporations like Fairphone. And I think a big part of it is what is life in a very broad way. Like, what is life affirming? Like, what is affirming the integrity of our languages? Like, for example, Tehiku Media, which was actually created, the AI model they created was to reach 1 million Maori speakers. And what does it mean for an AI model to preserve the integrity of a language versus being good enough? What does it mean for technology to be something to that future generations have something to look forward to. And once you start designing from the perspective that, okay, 3 or 4 generations, 7 generations forward, that reorients your compass and your framework for design. It restructures how you think structures should be built, because now you're incorporating the idea of data as knowledge, as something beyond market value. And you're also thinking about a positive interest in, I don't know, youth, like 100 years from now, like what do you want to leave behind, and what and how do we live, like what do we want to preserve, and how do we communicate that knowledge through technology? AI is a deeply human technology. It embeds our biases, our feelings, our emotions, who we are within this cultural political moment, and that doesn't have to be negative.
I'm quite positive about the policymakers somewhere, high level, because in the end, we mentioned eco-design directive, those kind of things. In the end, it's good to see that now it's forbidden to have a non-long-lasting fund in the market in Europe. So, and therefore, the tech companies need to innovate to be long-lasting, which is good. Which is, I think, for me, more challenging is to change the tech culture, which is, as you said, Nadia, not super diverse in the end, right? You have rich people, people from Western countries, the Silicon Valley style, more or less, right? And to change the mindset, this is really difficult. If you go to the MWC, if I take my example, my domain, mobile, so MWC is a big conference in Barcelona every year about the mobile innovations, and everything is about the high tech and not the low tech, right? So to change that, it's very difficult. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, I do some lectures in some engineering school, and this is really difficult to say that, hey, actually people doing maintenance is great. Even when I was younger, as a software engineer, when I had a mission, a project, when I had to do maintenance on a project for a few months, I was sad. I was like, oh, boring. It's not boring. So we need to change this culture. We need to change this approach, and it starts at school. It starts at home. So it's really a long process. But I'm a bit worried about the tech culture, because this is really, really difficult to change because of this non-diversity.
No, yeah, giving for small model, they does exist. You have, for example, platform like Hugging Face that reference many open source model, and you could find them by size of your hardware or things like that. It's quite technical, I admit, but it does exist. It's just not mainstream, but you could have a look also at Frugal AI. And for example, in France, the standardization, there is a guide of Frugal AI, for example. It's an official guide that mentions tools you could use. And so, yeah, there is also good things in this field. And maybe there was a last question? No?
Hi, Rachel Winnie from the Centre for Resilience. Sorry, this might be a bit of a big question to end it on, but I just wanted to pick up on the comment around data sovereignty, and also about the kind of worldwide nature of technology that we're talking about. And that as we're in an era of increasing geopolitical competition, where you have effectively an American model of how technology has been done in a very deregulated way, and a Chinese model that's been done very centralized, but centralized around quite a different value system. How does Europe try to develop a model? What would be the kind of key principles for policymakers that allows Europe to be competitive? Because the accusation that gets Europe, right, is that it's too slow and it's too regulative, and that's why it's fallen behind, and that's grown dependency on Chinese and American tech as a result of that. So how do we get that balance right between fostering innovation and growth and being internationally competitive, but doing it in a different way that actually aligns with the values and the kind of ethics that you guys have been talking about? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe there is also a problem of funding. For example, talking about Mistral, which is a French startup, they have a huge valuation for a French startup, but when you look at the valuation of OpenAI, it's quite nothing, and it's their valuation is just what OpenAI earned in 1 month, I think. So yeah, it's really hard. It's also questions the funding of startup in Europe, and because we need really big amount of money, and so we expect to fund one actor or many actors, and it's really difficult to. It's a wide subject to how we fund startup in Europe. I don't know. Maybe.
Difficult to answer in 2 minutes. No, but I think this is a combination of all the topics that we mentioned before. So I don't know what we spoke about, the culture change in the tech industry, the fact that we should promote more the approach of low tech, mid tech, and not only high tech could also play a role here. We were using a few years ago the term of slow tech also, right? Which to a certain extent could make people afraid or not super enthusiastic. But in the end, this is also what we are used to do if we think about the automotive industry in Europe. If you look at the big brands, automotive big brands in Europe, they are used to innovate every 5 years, 4 to 5 years in the automotive sector. So we were used to that at one point. And why? Now, because of those piece of technologies, we need to innovate every 6 months, right? So I think we need to find a path here, but we have some good grounds, right, to do that correctly in Europe. That's my point of view.
I guess I do think that the ideas that we have around growth and innovation are narratives more than they are like or objective or like subjective. For example, with DeepSeek, it disrupted this idea that you need this elite Western education to be in order to develop a model, and it also disrupted the idea that you needed billions and that you needed the newest hardware. All of these ideas in a really wonderful moment were put into doubt. And I think that in terms of being invited here by Mozilla, it's like, how do we think creatively and around and step outside of these paradigms? Because that's where innovation happens. It's when you turn things on its head. It's when you it's when you look at something from a different perspective. If we're constantly focused on having tunnel vision about what it means to make money or to be on top, it's going to be incredibly hard to innovate anything at all.
Yeah, we didn't use the word sovereignty or innovation so much in the session, a bit by design, but I think it's telling that those are the questions, and it's a sense, how do we frame some of the things we're talking about in the words of the day, if that's how to get these ideas across. But yeah, thank you for those questions. We might have time for one more question. I think there was a hand over here, which we can take, or back there.
Thank you so much. I loved this panel. It was so interesting. And I just kept thinking, if only what you guys do would be the mainstream. And how, do you have any reflections on how could this move into the mainstream? I think it will. I think this is the thing you just said with maintenance is great. Yes. Like all the things you guys are doing. It's so any reflections on that?
But as I said before, if we imagine a setup where perhaps some institutions will by default buy those kind of technology, could be already something. Imagine at school, the government, people obliged to use some fair tech, then it can be a bit more mainstream, right? Because at home, the kids can look at all the kind of technology, etc. So if I think about 10 years ago, it's not the case, unfortunately, now, but the Ministry of Education in France, they had an agreement with the Linux Foundation, right? And then, unfortunately, this is not the case. They signed something with Microsoft more recently, but okay. If we go back to this example, it was also great to see in some schools, some computers with only Linux on it. So, we can think about how public institution could play a role for those kind of technology to become mainstream?
I guess I would say I work as a lecturer at a design institute with students who work in graphic design, fashion, and now more and more around computation. But I think the thing about my design students is that, look, when I was going to school and I was like studying urban design, I would walk on my campus, there was graffiti, people dressed in however way, because there was a lot of experimentation. Are you punk? Are you not punk? Now, when I go and teach, a lot of the students look like they're in shapeless, like H&M, Zara, black, gray, beige. And I think that part of doing work that you find important and fulfilling, which sometimes an opportunity or rare, but daring to be critical, to be honest, to ask questions, to understand that something like is important to you, to your community, to the way that you speak, to the way that you move. It's a different way of knowing. It's a different way of designing. It's also maybe even feeling. And can you bring that to the table? Because it is unique and important. And it is always, and I think that right now, when conformity seems like it might be safer, being able to speak more honestly, at least, or more critically about your perspective also attracts other people who might be interested, institutions, organizations. It's how you network. You cannot not say who you are and what you value and expect to create alliances or make change.
No, I think it's time to leave the stage.
But that's a great note to end on and a great final question. Thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you to CPDP for organizing.
Thank you.